Remember that your papers are due today by email. Be sure before you turn them in that you double check the matrix that sort of goes through how it's supposed to be laid out, check the requirements, make sure you're doing everything that you've been asked to do, right? If you have any questions on any of that, please ask me after class um, or by email, and I'll try to answer those. But again, email it as an attachment by the end of the day. If your image is really huge, you know, like 3,000 pixels or something, one of the things that you can do is to right-click on it and you can compress it, right? That makes it so that it will fit in the document. At the same time, the nice thing about Gmail these days is it automatically sort of throws it into a Google Docs folder when it's too big to email, right? But for those of you who are in visual stuff, you're going to be having lots of papers where you have images in there. And if you I think it's not right-click, but double-click on the image. On one of the toolbars up above, it says compress images. And you can actually shrink it down so that it's not, you know, 64 megabytes all by itself, right? It will shrink it to the size that you've already made it. So that's something to consider as you're working on your papers. If you have any questions about how to do that, don't hesitate to ask. So, Post-Impressionism. What the thing for today, we'll finish up Post-Impressionism and then we'll talk about the exam, right? So the last 15 minutes or so of class, we'll talk about the exam. We left off talking about Cézanne, but we were talking about the movement that historians now call Post-Impressionism, right? When, you know, in the second half of this class, we've encountered a lot of different art movements, right? A lot of different isms. And some of them were art movements that the artists themselves referred to, right? Like Impressionism. Now, the term was given to them by a nasty critic, but they adopted it. They liked it, right? Realism, a term that the artists themselves would have used. Romanticism. But other terms like Baroque or Post-Impressionism, Mannerism, these are terms that historians have given to these periods because they looked at the works of art from that period and saw something similar, some shared characteristics, right? So the term Post-Impressionism didn't exist for Cézanne or Seurat. Both of them were dead before the term was ever coined, right? It wasn't until, I think, 1912 or so that somebody first came up with this idea that, hey, these late Impressionists are doing things differently. And why don't we label it something different? Because it's not really pure Impressionism anymore, right? So what we looked at when we looked at Seurat and Cézanne was an interest on each of their accounts on something that is different from what the Impressionists themselves have been interested in, although it has connections. Not only were both of these artists members of the Impressionist group at one point or another, but in addition to that, they both are very much interested in sort of broken brushwork, the lack of blending on the canvas that we've seen with the Impressionists, that we even saw with the Realists as well. Right? They're both very much interested in the effects of color, very strong colorists. Cézanne, very much interested in working outside. In fact, when he joined the Impressionists back in 1873 as one of the original founding members, it was Pissarro, who we looked at, who told him, you should study outside. You should paint from direct observation. Right? Yeah?
And what's that term? That means not blending?
Well, there's lots of terms that mean not blending, but the way that Seurat does it is very particular, right? Yeah. And that is pointillism, right? And that was on the lecture from Tuesday, right? That's only really relates to Seurat. There's a couple of other artists that do that, right? He called it divisionism, but that shouldn't be applied to everybody's broken brushstrokes, right? That's those tiny dots of color that he used to sort of optically blend it, give it that sort of fuzzy quality, you know, furry quality, right? Okay, so Seurat is very much interested in one approach to painting that's quite different from the Impressionists, going to Brittany's question, which is this idea of pointillism, where it's about the scientific analysis of color, right? It's been very much influenced by modern scientific ideas about color. We only sort of scratched the surface with that, right? Talking about the color wheel. But there are physicists that are becoming interested in color as light light and light as a particle. And this is all part of that idea, right? Okay, so that's very different than Monet's interest in color. Monet's really simply trying to capture the effects of light and atmosphere at a particular moment, right? But for Seurat, it's much more studied, it's much more meticulous, right? No attempt to look spontaneous whatsoever. Even the poses all look frozen, right? Now for Cezanne, his variation from Impressionism is his interest in turning every part of the composition into a player, into having a role to play in activating the entire composition. And he said that we can look at nature and see it as if it were a series of cones and cylinders and what's the third one? Cones, cylinders, cubes? I don't think he said cubes. But you get the idea, geometric shapes, right, is the quote. And as we look at the work, we can see that he's looking at nature, and he's painting outside, certainly, but then he's using that visual inspiration to come up with a series of sort of block-like elements that fit together, so that even the negative space, like the sky above, has a sense of solidity to it, right? And even some of the colors that we see in the mountain, we can pick up in the sky. And some of the colors that we see in the sky, we can pick up in the mountain, even down into the quarry, right? And he's sort of stitching it all back together, looking outside, but he's not paying, he doesn't feel as if by putting it back together again, by reconstructing the composition, he doesn't feel that it's necessary to be utterly faithful to what he saw, right? And this makes Cezanne a very, very important figure in the development of art, right? We talked about that a bit on Tuesday. Did we look at this picture on the right? One of the very late ones, right, where we can see this idea of breaking it apart and putting it back together again without regard to the original observed reality really taking hold, right? So that the mountain really just becomes a series of colors, and only really distinguished by a simple sort of watery line that comes down right through. Here, it's better to do it this way. Sort of a watery line that comes down through here that gives you the sense of it being that same mountain, right? But again, he's putting it back together again without regard to what he sees, and instead thinking about the composition as a composition and the way in which the different colors work with each other, right? For him, this is the most important thing. It's really quite brave, right? It's really quite out there. And when he died in 1906, I think I mentioned this on Tuesday when Julie asked the question, when he died in 1906, there was a huge retrospective of his works in Paris. And everybody turned out, and Picasso loved it, right? Matisse loved it. They loved it for different reasons, you know? Some people love the separation of the color from the object, right? Some people love the construction of the works through a series of geometric shapes, right? Responded to this, and Picasso had a famous quote when they asked him, what did he think of Cezanne? He said, he's the father of us all, right? He's the father of modernism in many, many ways. Now, I wanted to look at one last Cezanne. I think this is the one that's on the slide list, which is the still life. Cezanne tended to work in traditional themes and then do non-traditional things to them, right? So landscape is a very traditional theme for artists, and he's doing something kind of radical and different within a traditional theme, right? And still life offers them the same thing. It's an acceptable form of art, right? A traditional form of art, and by choosing a traditional form, it can really highlight the radical steps he's taking within that form, more so than if he chose a radical subject matter, right? So when we looked at still lifes back in the 17th century in Holland, we talked about the fact that with a still life like this, all of the elements here are chosen because of their meaning, right? That Heyde has arranged these elements on the table and then painted it with the idea that he wants to talk about sort of moralizing themes, right? This was on one of the makeup screencasts, right, for the times that we missed. So the idea for the Dutch of showing some restraint as being part of the thematic elements that he's bringing to the picture by showing us a very sumptuous and expensive meal, but, right, showing us not every morsel being eaten, walking away from the table before you've gobbled up everything, right? How the reason for doing this is about your own physical versus spiritual life, that if we only satisfy our bodies, we might neglect our souls, that life is short, we never know when we're going to die, so one should think about more than just what tastes good, right? One should think about other things, and he symbolizes that through a broken beer glass on the pewter plate that's on the edge on the right, or the upended goblet next to the snuffed candle on the left, right? The pewter dish also upended, plates about to fall off, right? Life's precarious, right? Life can end, it's fragile. And one should think about that as one is going about their daily activity. Nothing wrong with eating. Nothing wrong with eating expensive things like olives, which are not native to Holland, or lemons, or oysters, right? Or mince pie. There's nothing wrong with any of that. The knife is out to extend to you, right? Nothing. But it's all about meaning, right? That's the still life really is born in an era when symbolism and meaning was really one of the artist's most prominent objectives. Now, for Cezanne, it's different, right? For Cezanne, he's setting up a still life not so much that he sees any great symbolic value to these particular pieces of fruit, or that milk jug, or that wine glass. It's rather a simple and spare still life. And what he's most interested in, why he's choosing the object he's choosing, is to give him the basis for this geometric construction of a canvas, right? The parts that can be fitted together and altered by him to make the final composition. So he doesn't really care. These peaches and apples, right? He doesn't care about whether or not apples are symbols of the original sin or anything like that. That's not on his mind. What's on his mind are the colors and the shapes, right? And how he might take what he's arranged on the table and then think about rearranging it as a painter, right? So if we look at certain things, like the dish of fruit, you'll notice that it doesn't really sit well on the tabletop. It's almost as if it sits up a little bit, and the fruit doesn't seem to sit on the flatness of that platter either. It's almost like it's tipped up, as if he's thinking about each part somewhat differently, right? And he's not really interested in this Renaissance idea of a unified perspective space, right? And that becomes really clear when you look at the table. And we think about the concept of unified space, which has existed for painters since Giotto, right? More strongly since Brunelleschi when he invented perspective, right? Since then, we've seen artists really strive to give us a sort of sense of unified space, with a few exceptions, right? Manet, Degas, right? The ones that are really trying to break free and do something modern that lead us to this. So if we look at the table, look at the slat on the right-hand side by the legs, and you'll notice that, perspective rules say that things get closer together as they move into distance, right? The highway effect, when you're driving down a long straight road, right? Comes together to a point. In this case, they diverge, right? He's consciously violating the rules of perspective. And the reason is that somewhere in the back of his mind, he's interested in the breaking up of those shapes in the lower right corner and how that works, right? And he really is interested in sort of this triangle here, this one here, brings the shadow from under the table into the leg, and it sort of violates the edge of the leg, right? And so this, he's worked it through, he's played it out, and he realizes if he brings it out a little bit better, it strengthens other areas of the composition. Right? That's what's on his mind for this. And if we look at the top of the table and the sides, we can see that everywhere he's sort of fragmented it. So not only does this brown table contain pretty much every color of the rainbow at one point or another, right? Everywhere we look, we see colors from the other parts of the composition, just like he did with Mont Saint-Victoire, right? But over and above that, we also see that he is perfectly willing to obliterate the things that he's seen. So the front edge of the table, the top edge of the table, right? We can make it out here, it's pretty strong, then it gets light again for no explicable reason. Then it gets a little bit darker, and then it kind of all but disappears over here on the left edge, right? Try to trace the back edge of the table. So come back here, and here's the back corner, and there it is. No, we're okay. It's there. It's very faint, but it's there. We come across, and it's gone. Right? It's gone. And then it's up here. Right? It's moved up. It doesn't trace through. And again, he's shifting everything around in order to think about the proportions of this to this to this as sections of the composition, right? And so he's absolutely unworried with objective representation, right? Even though it still is objectively identifiable. It's not hard to say it's fruit on a dish on a table. But it doesn't fit together with the rationality that had been around since the Renaissance. Cezanne is restructuring the canvas as he works. And this is quite apparent when we look, nice close-up here, the wine glass and how he's handled that wine glass. Not only does the edge of the tabletop, which you can see between the orange and the pitcher, disappear by the stem of the glass because he's interested in bringing that blue over, but if you look at how the glass itself is constructed, he's sort of drawn the top of the glass as if it was in perspective, but then he's kind of obliterated that. And he moved another line that echoes the edge of the glass up higher because he wants something else in the composition up there, right? So Cezanne really feels himself, and I think this is something that for him comes out of the isolation of working in Aix-en-Provence. Remember that he had moved from Paris after getting some really rotten reviews in the Impressionist shows. He moved from Paris to his childhood home in Provence, the town of Aix, A-I-X, right? Aix-en-Provence. And, inherited his father's mansion and lived down there. And working in isolation, relative isolation, allowed him to sort of just begin to think about breaking these rules, because it's now more of just kind of him, a dialogue between him and the work. And that working in isolation we find throughout the history of art often allows artists to really do something fantastic, right? Take the ideas that have been boiling and then have to worry about whether Anna thinks what I'm doing is any good, right? I just go do it. There we are, right? And after inheriting his father's mansion, he can be a man of means. He doesn't just have to sell anything either, which also helps immensely, right? Because you don't need critical praise in order to do it. Now these days we look back at Cezanne and say, this is it, right? This is really sort of the beginning of everything that happens in 20th century art with Cezanne. So he presents for us a different approach to what we now call post-impressionism, right? A very different way of thinking about it than Seurat. Seurat was all about the scientific nature of color. Cezanne is all about sort of the structure of composition, right? That's really what he's focusing on through his entire career. Now, there are other artists who go in different directions altogether. And the next two we're going to look at are artists who begin to investigate expressionism. Now, that's a term we haven't really used much yet. It's the idea of something that is more individualized rather than objective. Maybe Cezanne is kind of there, but Toulouse-Lautrec is interested in colors and shapes and forms that have an overtly expressive quality. So when he does images and he does mostly interiors, right? When he does images, he also begins to break with objective reality. On one level, the faces of the figures and their body shapes tend to become more caricature-like, cartoonish almost. He focuses very much on heavily drawn outlines, and those outlines become exaggerated, right? And become, through that exaggeration, more expressive. His color choices are not based entirely on objective reality, but are often chosen as well for their expressive quality. So the brightly dyed orange hair of the woman whose face is pretty much blocked by that hat is too orange, right? It's unreal looking. The overall green tonality of the interior may have been inspired by gaslight, the kind of lighting at the time, but it's so green everywhere that you know he's choosing that color expressively, maybe to offset the other colors, the purples and the reds and the oranges that we see highlighting the different figures. And then we look at the forms themselves, the green coat of the woman in profile directly in the foreground, right? And how Toulouse-Lautrec outlines that form, but then within it, it tends to be a sort of flat field of color. The woman facing her in the pea coat, right? Look at how he's emphasized the shoulder lines on that, right? Coming way up, and they become, again, almost cartoonish because they're so exaggerated. But the pea coat itself is, again, not really modeled in chiaroscuro, our old Renaissance friend, right? Of shading from light to dark. It's really an overall tone. Look at the woman directly behind her with the purple scarf around her neck. And look at her coat, right? It becomes like the floor in Cassatt. It just becomes this area of color, right? Surrounded by outline. All of this is really cartoonish, really exaggerated, and that's a hallmark of Toulouse-Lautrec's work. A lot of it comes from a dialogue between his work as a painter and his work as a printmaker. Toulouse-Lautrec was making posters for many of the cabarets in Paris at the time. And posters need to communicate in a very different way than paintings do. You see them on the street flashing by, and they tend to give us flat, broad expanses of color because of the way that they're printed. In prints like this, each color is a separate swipe through the printing process, right? So you get a yellow printing, a pink printing, a red printing, a blue printing, right? And as such, each one of them becomes a sort of a flat area of color. And you can see how some of that idea gets picked up in the way he paints as we look at the right. You'll also notice that some of these characters reappear in work to work. So this is La Goulou, who's one of the sort of the dancers at one of these cabarets, right? That's her with the strange hairdo, and that's her in the background with the purple, right? See the same less exaggerated hairdo. Her sister here, maybe that's her in the foreground. Hard to say for sure, right? But the standard denizens of the bar, and they reappear in all of his works. You can see the degree to which these are really caricatures, right? Exaggerations. And again, this is something, that kind of exaggeration is not something that we associate with the Impressionists. So it's another way in which Toulouse-Lautrec's works are often considered to be part of this post-Impressionist group. Right? Now you've heard about Toulouse-Lautrec, perhaps. His biography is fairly well known. He was short, this is him, right? Stood about yay, right? Came from a very, very wealthy family. Anybody with a de in their name and a hyphenated last name comes from landed gentry going back in European society. It's like being a von in Germany, right? The von Trapp family, right? Goes back. So de Toulouse-Lautrec, his family could trace their origins back to feudal lords in the Middle Ages from the city of Toulouse, right? Who married into the Lautrec family, okay? And Henri is the scion of that family, right? He's the sort of the next inheritor of the Toulouse-Lautrec fortune, right? Now, like the Habsburgs, which we talked about before, in order to keep the family fortune together, there was a tendency in European aristocracy in earlier centuries to inbreed, right? Marry a cousin that keeps the fortune sort of in a tighter circle. And it caused problems for Philip IV, Habsburg king we talked about, right? Where he had ugly deformed children who died young, right? He was himself not all that attractive. For Toulouse-Lautrec, it also caused genetic issues. And he was born with very, very weak bones. So when he was 12 years old, he shattered one of his thighs. And the next year he shattered the other one, and they stopped growing. And this is why he's so short. So it's not that Toulouse-Lautrec was, what's the proper word, dwarf, right, or midget or anything. He was actually, had stunted growth from birth defects. Now, for him, that led him to feel somewhat alienated from society, and he wound up going to live on in the district of Paris that was the seediest district of town, called the Montmartre. The Martyrs' Mount, that's what it means. It's the area, the only real hill in Paris, right? Where all the windmills originally were back in the Middle Ages, right? Because you put a windmill up where you get the wind, right? And by the 19th century, these windmills had all been converted into cabarets, right? So the Moulin Rouge, which you know, right? Because it was a movie not that long ago, right? That was a red mill, right? Bob's Red Mill. The Red Mill on the hill had been converted into this amazing cabaret with multiple stages, and the Moulin de la Galette was another one, right? Moulin is French for mill, okay? So Toulouse-Lautrec is hanging out at these places, right? And he's slumming it, right? He's wealthy, but he's hanging out with like riffraff, because these places were and kind of still are on the Montmartre a little dangerous, right? It's a good place to lose your wallet, right? But it's also a great place to go, you know, as the French go, right? That's it. You had too much. It's one of my favorite Frenchisms. It's the look at you, right? And Toulouse-Lautrec is out going, right? You're getting good and plowed, and getting into arguments and buying drinks for everybody. His family hated it, right? He's living large, living loud, and the interesting thing about this is the degree to which, why am I going into all this? You haven't really talked biography much, right? He's painting his world, right? Toulouse-Lautrec is painting the world that he inhabits. And he oftentimes, we can find him in the background of these things, right? Sticking himself in there, like this little sketch in Richmond, right? This is a tiny little that, it's a sketch. And the work on the right is done, sort of begun on site. It's on a piece of cardboard that he picked up, you know, from the kitchen, right, in the place. And you can even see the seams of the cardboard here and here, right? Just painting whatever you can find in the place, right? Conservator's nightmare, right? Because it's unprimed and all the oil just soaks into the cardboard and wants to rot, you know? But he's painting whatever he can find right there. And insofar as Toulouse-Lautrec is concerned, this issue of his biography is another thing that is different from the Impressionists, right? When Monet paints the Brigitte Argenteuil, we don't care what Monet was feeling. He wants it to be objective. He wants it to be, this is what light looked like at that particular moment. That's why it was all sketchy, right? It's just, this is what light looks like now. And it's not about me. He's this sort of, what do you want to say, non-filtered conduit for the light there to the canvas here, right? Toulouse-Lautrec, now that's not even, right? He is a very filtered conduit from what he sees here to what goes on here. And what we see there is not only what he saw, but what he feels, what he thinks, his attitude, right? So he gives us these bars where these people hang out, and you can see, God, right? I'm not advocating to you youngsters out there, but I've been there before, and sometimes you just want to sink into the corner, you're just like, somebody take me, you know? And they're drinking absinthe, which is distilled wormwood, it's a hallucinogen, right? It was banned for a long time, and it's just come back on the market now, but without the wormwood, right? But that green, glass of green that she has there, that's absinthe. And it was the rage, all the rage in the 90s, and they're just all, you can tell they're kind of glazed, you know? But look where you are relatively. You're not looking down on them, you're not judgmental, you're right there, right? You're with them, you're on eye level, you're sitting at another table in this bar. And you're Toulouse-Lautrec, right? You get to be him, engaged with these people at this particular establishment. So for him, his biography is kind of a key part of things, right? And that's something we really wouldn't, that idea of the psychology of the artist is not something that we would talk about if we were talking about Impressionism, realism, right? We talked about Manet in a social sphere, but we didn't really talk about Manet's biography, right? And how that might have affected his approach to certain subject matters. Right? But with Toulouse-Lautrec, we can't avoid it. Right? And with that kind of expressionism in mind, we turn to another of our great post-impressionists, Van Gogh. Another guy you've all heard of, right? Another one where his biography will enter into how we think about his pictures. What do you know about Van Gogh? What have you heard about Van Gogh? He cut his ear off. We all know that, right? He hacked off his ear. It was his, let's see, his right ear, right? Some usually in self-portraits will pose with his left ear toward you because the other one's gone, right? So he cut off his ear. What else do we know about him? Anything else? What do you have to be to cut off your own ear? Right? He was a little nuts.
Did he starve himself to be able to, or was that?
No, I don't know if he starved him. He was broke.
Yeah.
And living on the good graces of his brother, Theo, who lived in Paris and was a fairly successful art dealer, right? And the nice thing about Van Gogh is there's a long-standing, what do I want to say, correspondence between Theo and Vincent. We got all of his letters. And it's wonderful because he not only discusses the paintings he's working on and talks about what he's thinking about, which we just don't have for a lot of artists, but he also will talk about like how crappy his life is at those times. And the times when so Van Gogh, as he begins to crack up, right? He'll go through these phases where things are going okay, and then all of a sudden, boom, and he'll have these attacks. And not like epileptic attacks, but more like just, anxiety attacks. It seems to have been manic depressive, right? And then he'll rise up again, and as the letters will sort of help us trace that, as does his biography, because he eventually checked himself into an insane asylum, right? Voluntarily, so he wasn't locked up or anything. He could leave, walk around the garden and whatnot. He could have left at any time he wanted to, right? But as we look at the letters, we not only get this biographical sketch, but we also see these sort of, mood swings from elation is maybe not the right word, stability to instability, right? And as we look at the pictures he's talking about painting at those times, what we find is that the style of the pictures kind of changes as well, so that when he's having it bad, it gets more expressive. And when he's having it good, it gets a little bit more sedate, which is kind of fascinating, right? And again, the direct connection between psychology, right, and the painting. So, we've got a lot of Van Goghs around DC. We've got a whole room of them at the National Gallery. We're so lucky, right? The Phillips collection has a couple as well. And I wanted to use this one as our main example of Van Gogh. So Van Gogh began his career in Holland. He's Dutch by birth. Early in his career, he wants to be a preacher. And it's important to remember that within this sort of instability and psychosis, there's a strong religious element underneath all of that as well. And eventually he wants to be a preacher. He wants to be a preacher to the coal miners in Belgium. He wants to help society, right? And so that idea of being interested in the working poor, we talked about the connections between realism and impressionism before, right? Van Gogh kind of fits into that. Moves to Paris, meets the Impressionists, right as the Impressionist group is breaking up, right around 1886. Meets Pissarro, one of the founding Impressionists, whose works we looked at. Pissarro told Van Gogh two things that seem to have stuck. One, paint outside. Stop painting in the studio. He told Cézanne the same thing. Pissarro did, right? He's the old man of the group. The second thing he said, experiment with color. And what we see Van Gogh doing often is putting opposites from the color wheel next to each other, but in a totally different way than Seurat did, right? Where the brushstrokes have this vigor and vibrancy, right? Sort of a power and a gesture that you just don't see with Seurat. Right? So after spending about a year in Paris, he decides he doesn't like it there. He wants to get away from it all, and he moves to the south of France. This is right around the same time, a little bit after Cézanne had done so. Cézanne goes to Aix-en-Provence. Van Gogh goes to the town of Arles. Arles is about, I don't know, 50 miles or so from Aix. There's little evidence that he and Cezanne had anything to do with each other, right? But Van Gogh begins to work now in relative isolation. He wants to found a painting studio or a painting colony down there. He loves the light. He writes to all of his friends and says, you wouldn't believe the color down here, right? You wouldn't believe the light and the quality of light. And if you've ever been to Provence, he's right. I mean, it's stunningly beautiful there. Nobody really wants to come and join him, right? Because it's a little nuts, right? But if we look now at what he's painting and look at how thick the paint is. So thick that we have these major cracks running through it, but then also how vigorously applied it is and how he loves putting opposites on the color wheel, blues and oranges next to each other, right? Not that they actually blend in the way that a Seurat might blend. You would never call this pointillist, right? Because it's thick paint and it's expressionist, right? In that we see the way in which he's laid the paint everywhere on the canvas, right? It's such a dynamic way of painting, and really ends up having its own strong legacy as we move into the 20th century of expressionism, right? So with Toulouse-Lautrec and with Van Gogh, we have a sort of a different post-impressionist trajectory, right? One was all about color and structure. This one's all about sort of expressionism, right? Now, with the idea of expressionism, we take into mind what we found out already from your classmates about Van Gogh, that he's a bit off his nut, right? He's really having mental stability issues. And the image that he pictures for us here is the public gardens. So in a French city, public gardens are just that, right? They are a place where people go from their small apartments to enjoy sort of the outdoors. If you don't have a yard of your own in an apartment building, you go to the park, right? And it is ostensibly a place where the public mills, communes, gets together. And you'll notice the way that Van Gogh conceives of this space, right? Nobody is talking to each other. People are one person per bench, right? Benches that are made for 2 or 3. And everyone has a sort of do not touch, right, no man's land around them. There might be a little kid past the heavy woman in lavender there, but again, that doesn't seem like it's particularly close, and everybody is sort of staggered out through it. For him, for Van Gogh, with, again, the stability issues we've been talking about, the public space is not a space to go be happy, right? It's a space where people go, but they still remain sort of isolated. And knowing what we know about Van Gogh, this becomes a sort of strong issue that we see here, not just in this one picture. That many times his images give us a sense of alienation. Right? And if we think about where we are in the picture, you'll notice that the border of the public gardens is that line that comes across at an angle beneath the 2 fences, right? And we are outside of it. So whereas Toulouse-Lautrec puts us right at the bar, snuggled up close, right? Van Gogh sticks us outside looking in. So even though for him the public gardens is a place where people still don't connect, he's even more disconnected. We have to think about the vantage point that painters give us and how it might change the way in which we see the picture. And if we think about him being outside, and this being the entrance, there's a man reading the paper with this, what a posture. Right? Legs apart, like he's a guard almost, right? And he's got a paper up, again, no kind of connection, right? Because he's got this paper in front of him. And if we look at his face, he looks like the Scarecrow from old Batman comics. You know? He has no features whatsoever. He has this greenish face, and it's really depersonalized, right? And kind of creepy in its way, you know? That adds to this idea that even if this space isn't all that convivial, Van Gogh still can't go there. There's something about it that presents a barrier between him and social space, right? And it fits with what we know about Van Gogh's biography. all of this could be applied to his most famous work, The Starry Night, right? This is up in New York at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, so if you ever have a chance. But again, the idea of where he is relative to what he depicts. Now, it's a landscape, so it's a little bit harder to see this, but if you think about it, he's here, the town is there. Distance, right? Separation. And there's something between us, these cypress trees, right? That block part of a movement from here to there. Furthermore, we know from his letters that this was painted from his window in the asylum where he had himself checked in, right after having a breakdown. The asylum is outside of Arles in Saint-Remy, right? Hospital there. You can still go visit it, right? Have coffee or wine too, so to speak. This is the view from his window to the hills in the distance, right? And you can see that it's, on a certain level, all about separation and loneliness, because as he looks down on the town, he focuses on in the middle of the night, all the lights are on, right? Except in the church, of course, right? But everybody's gone to their homes, and there's these warm lights coming out of the houses, which suggest people up together, right? Suggests people having social interactions. And where's Vincent, right? Stuck in the asylum, separated from society. Now, at the same time, the most amazing thing, of course, about it is how he looks at nature as this thing where everything is alive, right? The way he applies those expressive brushstrokes suggests that every part of nature is almost moving as he looks at it. Unstable is a good word, given that he is, right? So instead of seeing the Milky Way, he sees these swirls in the sky. Instead of seeing light emanating from stars, it sort of almost becomes solid as it comes out from it. The hills in the background that we see, you know, if I gave you a detail of that and I said, hey, waves on the beach, you might believe me, you know? But really they're mountains and trees. And he simply is painting everything as if it's got a dynamic instability, which fits really with his sort of mindset at the time. We've got one of the pictures from the series down in Richmond, right? So this is the same, you can see the same mountains that we're looking at over there, right? Same approach, a little bit less hectic in the sky, right? But certainly that wheat field in the foreground has that same sense of swirling nature. Van Gogh would be really easy to know, wouldn't he? Because you haven't seen anybody else that looks anything like this, right? But then again, we've got trees in the background, olive groves and mountains. And you get a sense maybe in a calmer moment walking around the grounds of the hospital in Arles, but still picking up on these same issues, right? Of bringing that sort of vigorousness to his paintings. That kind of comes out of his mental state. Yeah, Brittany.
Is there a term for, I know pointillism is for like the fuzzy feeling appearance, because I see his like really swirly.
Yeah, no, there's not really a term for the swirliness. There is a term, I wouldn't test you on it, for the thickness of his paint, which is the word that we tend to use is impasto. And we would use that for any I-M paste O, impasto, right? And think about it as paste is a good way of remembering it. And we would use that for any artist that lays it on thick. So Rembrandt, for example. And by the way, he's a Dutch artist, so Rembrandt for him is like, wow, you know? This is part of the reason Van Gogh does so many self-portraits. Yeah, is because he was very much influenced by Rembrandt. And his early works are all brown like Rembrandt's are as well, carved ivory, you know? And it's only when he meets Pissarro that he goes, oh, color, outside, right? And he changes it. Okay? So impasto is as good as anything, but it's kind of a broader term than just what Van Gogh was doing, right? You would apply impasto to, I don't know, there's some late Monets we didn't look at, but certainly Pissarro's picture that we saw, or even some of Manet's. It's good and thick, a gummy, right? That we would call that. But there's nothing, right, because with pointillism, you know, Seurat said, I'm experimenting, and this is what I'm doing, right? He gave us this term he called divisionism, but it sort of morphed into pointillism. Van Gogh is not as interested in process, right? With Seurat and Cezanne, it's kind of a process thing. And for Van Gogh, it's about expression, right? The immediacy of that expression. Yeah. So somebody, yeah, Brendan.
So I don't know if I just heard this or not, but I've heard that like Van Gogh was one, like people have speculated that he might have been on drugs when he did it. But I'm guessing not since he was in the asylum.
Yeah. The thing of the big question is what pushed Van Gogh over the edge, right? What led to his precarious mental state? And there's lots of questions about this, and no specific answers, right? He was pretty broke, and most of the money was coming from his brother Theo, who I doubt would have sent him money if that were the case, right? But one of the things we think more recently is we know for a fact that the yellow that you see in the moon, right, or in the wheat fields in the foreground is incredibly toxic. These are paints we try to make them with non-toxic materials, but early on they were being made with chemicals, right? We're talking about now new paints, and the yellow itself is it's an early cadmium yellow, and it's just filled with something that's just horrifyingly bad for you, right? And there's some thought that he might have, because painters are always getting a good point on their brush by sucking on it, right? That's the best way to get a good point on your brush, make it saliva will harden it a bit. So if you got one that's been in the paint box and it's got a bend and you want it straight again, sucking on it's the best thing you do. And if you're doing that and you're then going to your paints, you're going to ingest, right? So there's some question as to whether or not he might have been, poisoning himself accidentally. But the issue, of course, with mental health is that sometimes there isn't an explanation, right? There isn't an easy explanation that a cause and effect sort of thing. Right? The thing about Van Gogh's mental health is that he's down in Arles for a couple of years, right, 2 or 3 years. And in 1889, in the spring of 1889, his father, or his brother Theo, asked him to come back to the region around Paris. Wanted to look after him more closely, was worried about him. And said, please come back. And so he relocated to the area just outside, kind of near where Monet had been living, like Argenteuil, that area, where the Seine works its way to Paris, right? To a little town called Auvers, Auvers. And he's under the direct care of a physician at that point for the last 6 months of his life. And 3 months, sorry, he puts out like 80 paintings in 3 months. Like just cranks. Can you imagine? 80 paintings in 3 months, right? And then shoots himself in the chest. It's like a not very efficient way of killing yourself unless you really want to suffer. And that seems to be the case for Van Gogh. He lay dying for a day and a half, right, with a bullet wound in the chest. So when he decided to finally leave this mortal coil, he decided that he was not done. He was bad. Yeah. Sad and horrible story, right? Yeah.
He gave landlord some paintings when he didn't have rent.
That's right.
Do you know which ones? Or?
No, I don't. I think we the scholarly community know what he did. When he was living in Arles, we have one more artist, but that's right. When he was living in Arles, he was hanging out at this house called the Yellow House, making numerous paintings of the Yellow House, which was and the people of the town talked about the crazy redhead living in the Yellow House because he was starting to kind of freak people out when he was in Arles, right? Because he was, prone to episodes. Right? And from what I know of Van Gogh, I'm a 15th century scholar. That's what my scholarship is in the 15th century. But from what I understand of Van Gogh, from the times I've taught 19th century art classes and whatnot, I just lost my train of thought. I totally lost my train of thought. What I know about Van Gogh is obviously not very much. Oh gosh, I totally lost it.
People in the town were afraid of
crazy. Yeah, but that's not helping me.
in the Yellow House.
The Yellow House. All the Daisy. He gave some paintings to the landlord. He was getting all of his paints from Theo, right? The only way he could paint it all was Theo would send him money to buy stuff with. That kind of with Brendan's question makes me think as well, right? With Theo sending money for drugs, that would be the case. It seems like we would probably have something about it. I totally lost it. But that's okay because you got something. Sorry?
That's what happens to us when we're taking the final.
That's right, you blank out. And that's kind of entertaining, fun. You just keep writing something. There's some wheat in the foreground, and then, oh yeah, right? You'll be like the guy in the Minotaur in the maze, right? You'll be following that string back out of the maze to figure out which way was the exit.
I'm curious about the difference in his, and maybe we don't know, maybe it's not significant, but in this one, it seems like his application of paint is similar throughout. In this one, it seems like it's decidedly distinct between different things that he's painting. Is there something to that, or is it just
Yeah,
purely
I think
depiction of
that's a
this?
good question. So for example, the kind of vigorous brushwork we see in the wheat field in the foreground of the one on the left, we see also in the sky and in the hills in Starry Night. But we don't see it as much in the sky here. It billows up, but it seems a bit more.
This seems like a deconstruction of what he's doing.
And what's interesting about this one is that the range, the change in brushstrokes can actually gives it a stronger sense of space, right? So as it moves further back, the brushstrokes become sort of less vigorous. And that's kind of nice, because then the things up close look like they're in focus, and the things in the distance, less so, which is normal, and it gives it a good sense of and here everything sort of lays on the surface with the Starry Night, in that all is painted in kind of the same way, right? The issue of why answered in two different ways. One is that Van Gogh is always experimenting with technique. But the other one is what I mentioned before about the sort of the mood swings, the ups and downs. And that people have pointed to this one as being, if we look at his time in the asylum in Saint-Remy, that when he's having a really rough time is when he paints the most vigorous, right? And so that could be part of the explanation in this. And I've seen this one discussed as, from the letters, he mentions this, right? And he mentions seeing the olive trees in the background. He mentions what he thinks about olive trees. He loves olive trees because these little sort of sage-colored things. Those are olive trees, right? And he says he loves olive trees because olive trees live forever. Like most olive trees are thousands of years old, right? They date back sort of to the time of Christ. And he likes that idea. They live on rocky soil when there's no support, and yet they thrive, and they thrive forever. And you can see this sort of projection, right? Cypress trees, he says. Cypress trees, he said, are like flames, and they do look like them, don't they? And he said cypress trees are like ancient pyramids in his letters. How an ancient pyramid bridged the area between the earth and the sky. Cypress trees kind of do the same thing, he said. They bridge the earth and the heavens, right? And in fact, cypress trees were mostly planted on the sides of graveyards. So they indicate death here, right, as well. So when we think about what he wrote about these things, they can help us to understand what he's thinking about the different elements. And I would argue here that this one is a calmer period for Van Gogh, his biography. Right? Let's get to our last artist, and then we can talk a bit about the final. So when Van Gogh moves to the south of France, and here's a self-portrait with the bandaged ear away from us, right? So we don't see it. He wants people to come and visit him, and one of the people he met while passing through Paris was Paul Gauguin. And they became like really good friends. And despite Van Gogh's religious underpinnings, they sort of went out and knocked it up a bit, right? They frequent whorehouses and lived loudly, right? And Van Gogh wants Gauguin to come and join him, right? He's the one who keeps writing, please come and join me down in Arles. We can set up an artist community there. And Gauguin finally says okay, right? And comes down to join him. And spends about 6 weeks there is all, right around Christmas time. I think in 87 or 88. And it was when Gauguin leaves, he's had enough of Vincent's craziness. It's when Gauguin decides to leave that Van Gogh cuts off his ear. Right? And one story is that Paul, please stay. Like that's gonna help. Right? Look what I've done. And so anyway, good friends, ends up in Arles. Okay? Can't tolerate it, leaves. Now, Gauguin, self-taught artist, began his career as a stockbroker, decided late to become a painter, was inspired by the Impressionists, was showed in the very last Impressionist show. So it picks up their interest in color, in sort of this modern way of painting with the broken brushwork. On leaving Arles, he decides he's going to move someplace more isolated. Again, there's this interest in artists in getting away from it all, right? In isolating themselves. And Gauguin moves to Brittany. Brittany is the westernmost part of France, right? So it faces the English Channel on the north, faces the Atlantic, right, to the west. So if you think about Europe, right? Let's see here. This is Brittany here. This would be Belgium, Holland, right? Germany. And then let's see, this would come down to this. This is Spain, right? Comes over and then this is Italy, right? Provence is sort of right in there on the Mediterranean. This is Mediterranean. There's waves. Yes. That's where Provence is. That's where Arles and Aix are, where Cézanne and Van Gogh are. He's going to move here to Brittany, which to this day remains one of the most isolated parts of all of France. And in French, in fact, the county is called the end of the earth, the Finistère, right? Because it juts out into the ocean. And in Gauguin's time, and as today, local customs are really strong. And this is what brings him here. He's looking for something different. And as a post-impressionist artist, Gauguin presents to us something that we didn't see with either Van Gogh or Toulouse-Lautrec. And that's an interest in symbolism. An interest in sort of spirituality. He's looking for something in existence that bridges the physical world with the metaphysical. And he thinks that modern cities and industrial progress have gotten in the way of that. They've separated us from something that is primal to our nature, a connection to bigger ideas, right? Metaphysical issues. God, however you want to think of her or him, right? He wants to find a culture where people are more in touch with how things used to be, and thus more in touch with a sort of spiritual nature. And so he leaves, and this is also very antithetical to Van Gogh. This is not what Van Gogh's interested in at all. Van Gogh's a personal dialogue sort of thing, right? So Gauguin ends up going to Brittany in search of local customs. And he becomes just enthralled with the costumes, the clogs. He carves himself a pair of his own clogs, right, while he's there. Girls dancing in a wheat field after it's been harvested. It's a cute little puppy dog, right? But they're dancing in the wheat field. And he sees this as sort of evocative of some sort of primal pagan ritual almost, right? But it's spiritual for him. And he's fascinated with this. So when he goes to Britain, he tends to focus on rural customs that have never changed. And he's trying to amplify with them a sort of spiritual quality. His most famous work from this period, in Edinburgh, Scotland, The Vision After the Sermon, where he begins to push this interest in these activities as having spiritual meaning. He pushes that idea by making the color absolutely non-realistic. Now, not everywhere, right? Not everywhere. But if you look at the ground, there is no way that the ground is this red, right? And what that is meant to do is to jar us away from thinking about the world that he looked at and think about that world in a sort of more visionary state, right? Hallucinatory state. So the vision after the sermon, as he explains it, right, is a group of women, all with their local Breton clothing, have come out of the church, and they've heard a sermon on Sunday morning. They walk out of this church, and the sermon has inspired each of them to have a collective vision. So when they walk out of the church, they see in the square of the town a wrestling match. And this is actually kind of common in Britain, apparently, at least in the 19th century, was to have these sort of Sunday afternoon wrestling matches. And as the women come out of the church, having heard the sermon, they look at the wrestling match, and they have this vision based on the sermon. Because the sermon was all about the book of Genesis, where Jacob wrestles with the angel. And that's what they see, instead of actually seeing the wrestling match. So we have an angel and Jacob, the Old Testament figure, wrestling in the square behind them. And this is supposed to be now an evocation of that vision, right? Now that idea of a visionary quality, right, a supernatural vision rather than an objective observational image, this again separates him from the Impressionists, right? It's very, very different from what they would have done. And that vision becomes a sort of fascinating thing because not only does the color not make any sense, but the space doesn't make any sense either, right? The white hats worn by the Breton women are all heavily outlined, and then as we move back into space, the space gets sort of violent. There's this broad close-up, and then directly behind her, figures tiny by comparison. Behind them, still figures still smaller, and in front of them, a cow. And you try to explain the spatial, right, the size relation between these three things. Where is that cow? It's all meant to sort of shake you out of thinking that it's observational, right? This is a spiritual representation. Now, the kind of color that he uses, which is so high-keyed and surrounded by outlines in these sort of flat fields, he calls it synthetism. He's synthesizing meaning and color together. The color is meant to have its own meaning, right? And so all of this suggests that it's a visionary state, right? He's really pushing himself beyond objective description. Now, the fascinating thing about the picture is that of all the women, we have a figure of the preacher, right? The cleric from the church in the corner, right? His eyes are down as well, and you can see it's him. Look at the nose, right? That hooked schnoz. That's a self-portrait of Gauguin in the corner of the vision after the sermon, and here a self-portrait of him down in the National Gallery. In both of these images, Gauguin presents to us something that's important for understanding Gauguin. In the vision after the sermon, he's the preacher who inspired their vision, which is kind of cool because he's the painter who inspires ours, right? He's the one who created the vision, which fits for how he paints, right? The painter who gives you a visionary experience. At the same time, as the preacher who inspires a vision makes him a sort of a saintly figure, doesn't it? Right? One who inspires something good, a connection to the spiritual world. But directly between the women and the vision is what? An apple tree. Now, apple trees are plentiful in Brittany. Brittany's known for its cider, right? There are lots of apple trees there, but Van Gogh means it symbolically. This is something we haven't seen in a long time. Art that has this sort of symbolism, right? The apple tree, obviously a symbol of temptation. So Gauguin becomes, in this picture, both a saint and the devil, right? The preacher who inspires their vision, and the snake, right? Who tempts. Why else is Gauguin surrounded by women? Right? Now go to our self-portrait, National Gallery. Saint, right? Halo overhead, right? But maybe some people suggested maybe he's John the Baptist, head on a tray, right? After Salome dances for King Herod, asks for the Baptist's head. Because how do you explain that yellow stuff at the bottom? You don't, right? It just flattens out the surface, same red in the background. So there's a saint on one hand, maybe even a martyred saint on one hand, but at the same time, right, it's a devil. Got the apples right behind his head. That flower in the foreground morphs, changes, becomes a snake as it goes through his fingers, holding it almost like a cigarette, right? So with the combination of a serpent with the apples, of course, we got this idea of him being two things, right? Saint and devil at the same time. Brittany wasn't enough for him. Brittany was still to develop, and Gauguin goes further afield at the end of his life. 1892, this is his first year there. He spent the last 10 plus years of his life in Tahiti, which was a French colony at the time. Now, Gauguin left a wife and 2 kids behind, never went back. Like Van Gogh in Arles, he's deeply broke. He's painting on canvas bags, burlap sacks, from boats that have stopped on the shipping routes. right? Stretching those onto the stretcher bars and sending them back to Paris after he's done. Right? For him, again, going to Tahiti was part of this hope to discover an underdeveloped country. European way of looking at it, we're no better than America, right? Very Western way of looking at these. Oh, these underdeveloped countries are exotic and different than we are, right? He's hoping to go down there and find something where progress is never set foot, right? European progress is absent. When he got there, he found out it wasn't. There was a good town that built up around the fort, but he never paints that. He only paints the natives, right? Because he's trying to immerse himself in this sort of made-up anthropology, right, of getting to the source of things. So painting these things, sending them back to Paris, they're total mysteries when they come back to Paris because they only have the Indonesian dialect title, right? We can translate it now. He could translate it, but he didn't tell people when they went back what it was all about, right? And they were seen as these strange and mysterious pictures. Now you'll notice that he still is very interested in colors that don't reflect the observed world. Right? The purple around her feet. The red of those flowers might be tropical flowers, but he's not rendered them like such. They just become these sort of stains of amazing red that come across the surface. That wonderful flower in the upper right corner, right, may well be a tropical flower, but he paints it sort of as an anamorphic device. It almost looks like it's alive, like it's a face or something. The tree trunk in the upper left corner almost becomes like a unicorn. You know, like he's seeing within nature something extraordinary, right? Something spiritual, as it were. And then we get this title, The Words of the Devil. Right? Now, one thing that we could probably agree on is that the woman in the middle, or off to the right, is hearing the words of the devil. The pose that she has with her hand to her cheek, over by her ear, suggests listening. She is hearing the words of the devil, but who is the devil? Whose words is she hearing? One way to approach it is the figure in the back. Because if you look at the figure in the back, it's kind of creepy, isn't it? The way the eyes are lit from below, how they're the only sort of bright white parts on the entire canvas, how the hands of that figure become like claws, how the foot of the figure in the background is extraordinarily distorted. Right? All of that suggests that maybe that's the devil. And she looks kind of askance over her shoulder. Right? Now, what is she seeing? Who is that figure? That's harder to say. Could the figure be an idol in the village that she imagines to be something else? Just like with the vision in the sermon, they come out, they see the wrestlers, and they imagine it to be something else. Are we seeing her vision? Are we seeing the world around her transform into something visionary, supernatural? That's one way to look at it, right? Another way to look at it is that the devil is Gauguin, the painter. And with this, we know some biographical details. When he moved to Tahiti, he set up a house with the native villagers outside of the European center. When he did, they gave him a wife, which was a custom of the village. She was like 13. That's her. And the way that she's standing, coy, one hand in front of her genitalia with a cloth, suggests immediately post-deflowering. And that if the words of the devil is the title of this, could those words be Gauguin's seduction? Right? Now, in the customs of the time, seems perfectly okay, but remember he's got a wife and kids back home. Right? And he does tend to put himself forth as this figure who is, one, in charge of visions, and two, both a saint and a devil at the same time. So there's every possibility that she is listening to the words of the devil, and we are left with this open-ended question of whether or not the words are coming from this figure in the background or from the guy on the other side of the canvas, who is Gauguin. Now look at her pose, right? A woman, one hand in front of her genitalia. Does that remind you of anything? Eve. Exactly right. She looks a lot like Eve, and Van Eyck's Eve here. She's not going so far as to make her holding a fruit or anything, right? So certainly this is coming into the mix. But the other thing that's coming into the mix is Venus. That's the standard pose for Venus, is to cover up part of her breast with one arm and her genitalia with the other. And so for Gauguin, not only is he both, right, devil and saint, but the woman in this picture is both Eve, right, the one who is tempted on hearing the words of the devil, but also a goddess, right, the goddess of love. He loves to mix these things up and have these multiple layered symbolisms in his work. And that would be something that totally makes him different from the Impressionists, right? He wouldn't talk about that kind of symbolism in Monet. What we talked about with Monet was his interest in sort of capturing light and maybe his interest in the industrial progress around Paris, but we weren't looking at images that had this layered symbolism, right? That sets Gauguin apart. Now the colors we've been seeing, the way that they're approaching art at this point in the post-impressionist era sets up very much the stage for what's going to happen throughout the entirety of the 20th century. We're not into it very deep. We only saw one or two pictures in the 20th century. If you're into it, we're offering a class in the fall, right? Movements in modern art, we start sort of here, go through the 20th century. So if you're interested, that's a writing intensive class, so you can get that out of the way for your core. And we'll be doing more museum trips than we do in this because it's a smaller class, right? So if you're interested, look that up. We've got about 5 minutes left. I wanted to talk quickly about the exam. I don't have as much time to talk about as I'd like to, but I would like to go over what you can expect on the exam. Okay? The format is exactly the same as the midterm. Okay? The format follows that basic outline. The only difference is the number of questions in each section, okay? So there are, and no artist repeats, no artist work is shown twice, just like on the midterm, okay? There might be a question about an artist in the terms section where an artist's name would reappear, but pictures by the artist are only ever shown once, okay? So there are 10 known slides: artist, title, date, which is the half century, and the movement or the period. Those will all be in a footer at the bottom of each page again to make it easier for you. 9 known slides or unknown slides where you just have to identify the artist, and I won't be trying to trick you. So if you see a Tahiti picture, it's Gauguin, right? It's not going to be some other artist who went down to, and aren't I more clever than you? Right? That's not the point. The point is to see what you can do. Right? And so on all of those, I won't be trying to trick you. Right? So 10 knowns, 9 unknowns, 5 terms, basic questions based on the terms on the back of that sheet. Very straightforward questions. No sort of trivial pursuits sort of stuff. Really direct things that seem to have a large impact on what we've talked about. A series of short essays. On the midterm, there were 2 of these. For the final, there'll be 3. Okay. Each of them gives you a choice of 2 different pictures with a single essay question where you choose one and write about that question, right? Then finally, there's a compare and contrast where I show you 2 works of art that have a very, very similar theme, but treat that theme very differently. Now, for the essay part of the exam, go back and look at numerous things that can help. One would be obviously your notes, right? Another one would be to play back any of the recordings for things that you might have missed, right? But also pay close attention to on Canvas, there's a guidelines for taking notes, right? Little suggestions for note taking. Right? Where it basically goes through a series of questions on the 3 basic things we always talk about. Right? We talk about meaning. Sometimes that involves symbolism. Right? We talk about style, Gauguin's choices of color. And we talk about historical context. So one of the things that would be very, very helpful to everybody in the class, certainly is helpful to me when I was studying, is to take your notes and rework them. Rewrite your notes. If you've got them on paper, put them in a computer. When I was an undergrad, we didn't have computers, right? Selectrix typewriter. But when you do that, you're transposing your notes, you're thinking about them because you're writing them. And try to organize them when you do it so it makes sense to you. That's when you'll actually learn the material. Right? Do things that are proactive and you'll learn. Right? Flashcards help extraordinarily well for almost everybody. With the picture on one side, the information about it on the back, and as you test yourself, write it down. Because your hand remembers things your head does not. Surprisingly, right? You can make it work that way. And since it's a written exam, you want to try to replicate the exam environment as you study. So write things down. The more you write things down, the more you will learn it. I guarantee it. Right? But go back and think about those, use those three basic issues. Did we learn something about historical context? Did we learn something about the style? Did we learn something about the meaning and the symbolism? Right? And there's sub-questions for each one of those that you can use. Now, exam is on Friday? No, Tuesday at noon, right? Is that right? Tuesday at noon? Some of you have talked to me about taking it with the Thursday class at 3. If you want to do that, please send me a reminder so I know how many exams to have, right? That's the one sort of makeup time that I've got, okay? Now, I have someone else who's doing a makeup exam on Friday morning at 10 in my office. I could fit a few more people then if it's absolutely necessary. So if you've got, if Andrea has like 4 exams on Tuesday, talk to me, right? We'll move it to another day. Now, the rest of my week is kind of booked up, but I do have a few slots, right? So Thursday at 3, you can take it with the other class, or Friday at 10, sitting uncomfortably in my office, right? I'll be here Tuesday all morning. Oh, yeah, Tuesday all morning, I'll be here all morning. And that means if you have any questions as you're cramming in the last minute, you can drop by my office and ask them, right? I'll try not to get in here until about, just 5 minutes before because it creeps people out when I'm sitting up here and you're still studying. But I will be, just behind that wall if you have any last minute questions. Or over the weekend, right? I'll be happy to answer questions then because I'm going to be hunkered down with your papers, grading. So remember that your papers are due by the end of the day today, right? I'll start grading them in the morning by email. Okay? Any last minute questions on any of this? Yeah.
No Northern Renaissance or mannerisms
starting with Baroque Italy. Yep. I've chosen everything off of the slide sheet.
Okay.
Right? And I actually have the exam written, but I was waiting to see if we got through Gauguin or not, and we did. Right? So he can stay on the exam. He's on there somewhere. I'll tell you that much. Right? In one form or another. Okay? So as you're studying, don't hesitate to ask questions of anything that wasn't clear, and I'll be happy to answer those. Okay? Good luck, and good luck on all your exams next week.